Hello everyone, welcome to the Grim Dawn class examination. This is a redo of the Druid. Again, I'm trying to redo these class examinations to be a little bit more specific. Now, I'm taking a temporary break from the previous series I'm in the middle of because I did receive a request by T8365 to talk about the Druid. Not necessarily a request for a video, they just asked my opinion on skill setup. It didn't go beyond skills. So again, since I like to start off my class examinations with this, I decided I would record the first episode of this series and then go back to the other one and then finish this up after that, just that way T has, a bit more of a concrete answer. So the Druid is fairly interesting in that you've actually got basically two copies of essentially the same ultimate, and this is something that I want to address really quick before we hop into the skills. Star Pact increases cold and lightning damage. Skill cooldown reduction, a little bit more focus on the frostburn damage. Converts Aether and physical damage to cold damage. That's nice and all. Shaman has almost an exact copy with Stormcaller's Pact, but swaps the frostburn damage for electrocute damage, and otherwise has a chance for bonus electrocution, bonus lightning damage, and converts physical damage to lightning damage. So how specifically, which one of the two elements, should you choose to go into one of these you want to focus on, will discern which one of these two you really go for, unless you have a piece of equipment that boosts one or the other. But with that being said, this is actually a really nice combination to use. This is a really nice class to use because it's very straightforward. It's pretty easy to understand. It very easily integrates a secondary damage type to whatever your primary is without any kind of issue. So let's get right into some of my favorite builds and then talk about the skills, the individual skills that I do and I do not like. So one of my favorite ways to build the Druid is, of course, using two-handed, because two-handed weapons absolutely slap, and I love them. So going into that, you would want Iskandra's Elemental Exchange, and Overload at the very least. If you do nothing else as far as this, Overload is really nice for the offensive ability increase and the Aether resistance. Now, Elemental Balance is something that I like to pick up a lot of the time, but you don't necessarily need to. And then another, we go really full-on into the idea of the regular attacks. We just absolutely go ballistic. We go brute force. Obviously, we're using two-handed weapons, which, by the way, if you're using two-handed, go for the Might of the Bear. Increase your damage output. Get that physical resistance. It's absolutely fantastic. Now, this is, the baseline of how I really enjoy playing this. Now, keep in mind that when I play this, I actually don't usually go for Star Pact for one very important reason. If I don't choose to go for Star Pact, I can pull these points all the way back here to Elemental Balance, because I don't really use anything past that for Druid if I'm using a two-handed build. A lot of the time, I just don't need a lot of this stuff. You don't really need Mental Alacrity a lot of the time, because this is an auto-attack focused build. I will often build Maven Sphere for that damage absorption. I'm famous for loving that. Inner Focus is also something I frequently pick up. The Spirit boost increases your elemental damage. Obviously, the offensive ability helps you hit and with your crits, so that's really nice. But what else do we do? We obviously will want to be running Stormcaller's Pact here. Now, you already have a built-in secondary damage type in the bleeding here. That whatever physical damage you are doing, if any, I believe Brute Force adds some. Yeah, Brute Force adds some. That's being converted to lightning, so that's fine. Now, how exactly you approach from here really depends as well. Furthermore, you don't necessarily need to go for Maven's Sphere. This is specifically an auto-attack focused build, but you don't necessarily need to go quite so full ham on this either. For example, you could go into Primal Strike, which is something I often find myself going into, and frankly, if I was really going to go into Primal Strike, I would not have these, because I would want to go full-on into Primal Strike. Or if you want, you can do a hybrid here, because this, at the very least, get Torrent, so you can stun multiple targets. This is just extra damage, which you don't necessarily need. It's just nice to have, and then put the remainder of your points in either Maven's Sphere or Inner Focus if you choose. But there's an alternative. Now, Brute Force is just really nice. I'm sorry, Brute Force. Primal Strike is just really nice because it does that lightning damage that you're already trying to increase. It stuns the enemy. It does that bleeding damage you're really looking to use as your secondary damage type, which is really nice because a lot of enemies that are resistant to elemental damage often aren't resistant to bleeding, and vice versa. So that's a really nice secondary damage type to add to this. Whatever you do, please don't use Thunderous Strike. I hate this. Losing the stun and the damage is not worth being able to spam this. I'm going to be really honest. This is not any more effective when well, I can't say that. There have been 1 or 2 moments where I've had a lot of fun with Thunderous Strike, but 9 times out of 10, this is a impediment to your setup. So I would recommend staying away from Thunderous Strike a lot of the time. Now, again, you don't necessarily need to go full-on into Primal Strike either if you really don't want to. You do have some alternatives. Namely, you can actually enjoy all of the glorious benefits of Maven's Sphere of Protection and Inner Focus. And you can also enjoy a really nice Storm Totem. Now, the last 10 points, if I'm going to do this, are going to go right into Arcane Will. It cleans out your points just exactly. Arcane Will is just a lot of nice bonus damage. It is interesting to note, and this is not something a lot of people know nowadays. This was well known way back in the day when the community was smaller, but now that the community is rapidly expanding in number because of some revival of interest in Grim Dawn, it's not often known that Storm Totems don't ever miss. I don't know if they changed that, but as far as I know, they have not. I've never seen a Storm Totem miss an attack. I don't think they can. I don't think either of the totems can miss, but this is quite potentially very powerful. You can just absolutely bust this out and have some extra damage. You can bust these out around yourself if you're using ranged as well, and they can protect you from enemies coming into melee range, which is a lot of fun and something I often do as well. So regardless of how you want to run this, whether with melee weapons or with ranged, you've got a whole bunch of incredibly effective options. Now, personally, when I use the two-handed ranged weapon, I'm usually going to go into Storm Totem. I'm going to go into Inner Focus. I won't necessarily go into Maven Sphere, but sometimes I will. It really depends. If I'm not going to go into Maven Sphere, I'll usually go into Mogdragons, just for the health and energy regeneration. That physical damage will be converted into lightning damage. That's something else you can do if you really want to. But this is usually how I'll run a two-handed ranged. If I'm running two-handed melee, I'm usually going to go into Primal Strike. I'm actually going to pull these points out while I'm talking about this. I'll usually go into Primal Strike if I'm two-handed melee, because ideally that chains into zapping enemy ranged, especially if you can get in close enough. But it's a really great, easy to understand build, because you really don't have to do a whole lot with it. It just auto attack benefits and just absolutely slaps, and it does really well. Overall, I've always been really happy with this build. It's straightforward, gets the job done, and if you're one of those people who likes to play Grim Dawn while doing something else or listening to something else or whatever, this is a really great build for that, because especially if you're running the Primal Strike, you can just assign this to your right click, and then your auto attacks just do all the rest of the work. So you do have that benefit as well. So this is a really great build for that. Now, what if we aren't using two-handed weapons, ranged or melee? Well, then you're probably looking to use a scepter, because if you're using a scepter or an off, or whatever they're called, focus, you can actually, a caster offhand, that's what they're called. You can use Albrecht's Aether Ray and Devastation. Now, there is some interesting possibilities here with the fire damage side of the Arcanist, because you can actually get more along the lines of true pure elemental damage by playing your cards right here. So let's say you're not using a two-handed weapon and you are using a caster offhand, right? Now, primarily, you're probably going to be wanting still Maven's Sphere. You'll be looking for Albrecht's Aether Ray. Now, while you could go into Devastation, I don't tend to go into Devastation with the Druid. I tend to go into Albrecht's Aether Ray, primarily because, while it does fire an Aether damage here, at Disintegration it picks up lightning damage, which you can then, of course, use to your advantage. Now, exactly where you want to go from here really depends on how dedicated you are to the good old casting lifestyle, right? You could go into Mental Alacrity, which will help with your Albrecht's Aether Ray a lot, and of course Inner Focus does that as well. But from here, at this particular point, where you want to go again from here is really heavily dependent on your goals here. For example, I often will bust out storm totems, so once again, I can layer, I can surround myself with storm totems really quick, and then start blasting people with Aether Ray, right? Another good idea is actually to pick up at least the first stage of Mogdragon's Pact for the energy regeneration. If you don't even pick up the rest of this, that's fine. I mean, Heart of the Wild, I tend to pick up because the increased health is really nice, but I don't necessarily always go for Oakskin. Again, these are really nice resistances, but they're not strictly necessary. But at the very least, if you are going to be busting out a Albrecht's Aether Ray focused build with a caster offhand, you probably should be picking up Mogdragon's Pact for the energy regeneration, if nothing else. So you've got that. But again, how you want to finish this up really depends. You could go into Reckless Power and really dedicate yourself to the fire and aether damage, in which case, how you want to clean this up, again, falls to your personal preferences. Personally, if I'm running Reckless Power, I'll usually run Kalidor's Tempest most of the time, because then when the enemies do get into melee range, I can just blast them away, and then from Shaman, I'll just go ahead and grab Heart of the Wild here. I'll grab Oakskin, pull back these points, obviously. And then we'll just go into Arcane Will, and then at this point, maybe put some points into this for the energy regeneration once again. At this particular point, I mean, you could actually go fully into Escondra's, again, just for the energy regeneration here, and then just put your last 3 points in Arcane Will. That's fine as well. It really depends on which one of the two you prefer, but you're really not going to be looking to use a whole lot of auto attacks with this build, because you are looking to do that damage through Albrecht's Aether Ray. But there is another possibility, of course. You don't necessarily have to use Reckless Power. You can go into Star Pact, which kind of balances out your damage output here into Cold, Lightning, Fire, and Aether. So you're basically doing all 4 of these damage types pretty consistently. Now, the reason why this isn't my favored way of building Druid is because, unlike with the auto attacks, where you have Bleeding as a secondary damage type, which is very effective against anything resistant to Elemental, you don't really have that response. A lot of enemies that are resistant to Elemental are also resistant to Aether, so there is a bit of a problem there. I'm talking specifically about the Ethereal faction, which generally tends to be very highly resistant to both Elemental damage. At least a third of your Elemental damage is well resisted by Ethereals, if not all 3. And they pretty much across the board resist Aether damage pretty well. So that's a bit of a problem with this build. I'm much more likely to use this build when I'm playing with friends or family, because they can cover my weakness to Ethereals. There are also items you would probably want to lean towards building in those circumstances as well, but they're not strictly necessary. The reason why I don't necessarily recommend picking up such things as Grasping Vines, although you absolutely can, is primarily because you're interrupting yourself to put down something that's not necessarily going to hit that hard because you've got 0 support for this. Storm Totem, you're increasing that lightning damage through Star Pact, potentially, or if not, you can use Reckless Power. If you're using Reckless Power, maybe go into Grasping Vines, maybe you go into Primal Strike instead. You can go into Primal Strike instead of putting all these points here if you want to as well, and maybe not necessarily use Arcane Will or Escondra's Elemental Exchange, but this is generally a great way of doing all 3 elemental types and Aether damage. Again, this is not my favorite way of playing this. Now, there is a couple of other interesting methods that you can really utilize here, and I want to talk about these. These are much more slapdash, and you can do a lot of weird things with these, but give me a second to pull out these points so I can talk about this properly. The third general way, and this is really improv. This is probably what I'm about to talk about is probably the most improv series of things I've ever done, because I've played this a bunch of different ways because I've been fascinated by the idea. Now, I am pretty well known by now by my viewers for having an uncanny love of Alexa's Flash Freeze. I find this really useful, mostly because I really have most of my deaths in-game tend to come from large mobs. I don't usually die to bosses. It's usually going to be large swarms of lunatics. So I really appreciate Alexa's Flash Freeze in Absolute Zero for its ability to stop a lot of that from happening. But what fascinates me most about the ability is the resistance drops it offers. It offers physical resistance down at this stage at the Absolute Zero, and it offers fire resistance down at the base, which is really interesting to me because this opens up some really fascinating possibilities. But if you really wanted to utilize Alexa's Flash Freeze in an exciting and interesting way, then you could absolutely run Alexa's Flash Freeze, run Scunder's Elemental Exchange, Overload, Elemental Balance if you really feel like it, run Savagery again. Basically, it's the same as before. This is the absolute basic version, but I've found it very helpful overall. Pull this back. Go into Stormcaller's Pact. And then, actually, instead of, you'll notice that I haven't really put any points in Maven's Sphere. Actually, we can really go pretty ham on this and go this far back if you really wanted to. And I'll often build Kalidor's Tempest with this as well. And now, what you want to put your last 2 points into is totally up to you. But basically, the idea is freeze Kalidor's Tempest, start slapping people around. And also, it's you can do that. I've tried this before. It's okay. I find that because Kalidor's Tempest doesn't reach out as far as Alexa's Flash Freeze, that very often it's only really going to happen a lot in the, in the Shattered Realm. Now, it's just something that I've experimented with, and how you play this might be better than the way I play this, because you play it, you have a different playstyle, I don't know. But whenever I use Alexa's Flash Freeze, I'm usually going to be playing a ranged weapon, because you freeze from an incredibly large distance. You have a huge range on this. Alright, 16 meters is nothing to sneeze at. And again, I'll usually go into Primal Strike. Now, I forgot to mention this before, but if you really wanted to, instead of Primal Strike and using Stormcaller's Pact, you could instead, just as easily, go into Trozan's Sky Shard and Star Pact, right? Instead of Primal Strike from the earlier build. Now, when I go into Trozan's Sky Shard, I want to actually talk about this for a bit. Let's pull out Overload for a second, because I just want to max this. I usually won't go past Frozen Core. Now, I've discussed this in earlier videos, but I'm not the biggest fan of Shattered Star. I don't really find this to be worth the points that it offers, alright? The benefits of this aren't necessarily, for me, that worth it. Now, whether or not you go into Shattered Star is, again, entirely up to your preference. I don't often go for it, but that's just me. Now, a particularly fascinating and interesting point as well is sometimes if I'm going into the Alexa's Flash Freeze, I won't even necessarily go into Iskander's Elemental Exchange. Sometimes I'll just run these for the physical damage and just have a grand old time with that. That also can work. But beyond this, these are really the primary ways in which I approach the Druid. Now, you might be wondering, well, Professor, there's a whole bunch of skills you really didn't talk about. And yes, there's a couple of reasons for that. Let me pull these points out here first. But essentially, let's talk about some of the ones here in the Shaman. You'll notice that I basically didn't talk about anything that did vitality damage, and that's just because there's zero support for it. In all honesty, I mean, there probably are items that convert them into whatever damage type, but overall, we're not talking about those. We don't care about those right now. I can't remember any of them off the top of my head, but I know they exist. But this increases bleeding, right? Physical and bleeding damage. If you're running Primal Bond, and it is possible to make this work, if you're running Primal Bond, you're running Briarthorn. Absolutely. You're very definitely running Grasping Vines. Okay. You're probably running Mogdragon's Pact. Well, let's not go really wild here. Let's just stick with Heart of the Wild. You're probably running, at the very least, Savagery, although how much of Savagery you're running is entirely dependent on you and your choices. And then the only thing you're running from here, the only thing you would use in a, quote, pet Druid build is Alexa's Flash Freeze, and inner focus. There are a couple of reasons why. The fire resistance on Elixir Slash Freeze is not what you're looking for here. What you're looking for here is the physical resistance down, which helps your Briarthorn, which does a lot of physical damage, and also allows you to get a lot of physical damage out of Savagery. And if you're using two-handed, obviously you would go into Might of the Bear here, and you're just really absolutely doing a lot of damage that way. This increases your physical damage more, attack speed. You've got the Tenacity of the Bear, which just helps keep you alive. You've got the Grasping Vines. Now, I recommend the Grasping Vines over Wendigo Totem, although you can use this instead. Keep in mind that the Wendigo Totem and the Grasping Vines are interchangeable, but I just find them a little bit more effective. The enemy is frozen already with their physical resistance down. Now they're frozen in Vines with their physical resistance down. They can also be frozen in the Wendigo Totem as well. But the Wendigo Totem's range, like the actual range you can throw it at, is a little bit shorter. Well, actually, it's a decent bit shorter than the Grasping Vines is. So I just find the Vines a little bit more useful. They also cover a wider area, especially when you get them to, and this doesn't increase the area, but it just has more impact there. But this has a decent radius. This has, I believe, a 5-meter radius the whole time. Yeah. So it has a bit of a larger radius and just tends to be more useful there, but they are interchangeable, so pick whichever one is your favorite. Wendigo Totem makes up for the shorter range and shorter deployment range by having the ability to heal you, obviously. And of course, you could also go into Primal Strike instead, because that does physical bleeding as well. It's totally up to you, whether you use Grasping Vines, Wendigo Totem, Primal Strike, what have you, because again, at the very least, you want Torrent. But my problem with this build is Primal Bond itself. You're giving your pets a bonus to bleeding damage and all their damage, and you only have one pet. There is no plural here going on. Granted, there are items that you can pick up that give you more pets, but they don't necessarily work too well with Arcanists. Again, you still can equip them, that goes without saying. It's just, you do require some specific builds for this to work. Again, you would be wanting to bring in pets from items, because having just the Briarthorn itself alone does not really justify a strong pet build, at least in my opinion. Since they got nerfed anyways. Well, I won't say nerfed, since I've been readjusted, I'll put it that way. So I don't really recommend, unless you've got a specific plan and you have the items already set aside, it's probably not the best idea to go for pets. This is something that you would want to respec into in the late game when you have the items you're actually looking for. And I'll talk about that when I get around to the equipment portion of this series. We're not going to get into that now, but it is worth mentioning why I've pretty much avoided that subject entirely. At this particular point, without the use of very specific equipment, it really doesn't work out too well in the early to mid game. It only really can happen in the late game when you have very specific items. So I really didn't talk about that. Now, another thing is, I haven't really talked about Panetti's because compared to Iskandra's Elemental Exchange with the two-handed weapons, Panetti's is weaker, costs more energy, costs more skill points. Alright? When you're playing a Druid, you have access to better elemental damage. You could even actually do better than this with ranged weapons. Just run a two-handed ranged weapon, run Brute Force, bust out Iskandra's Elemental Exchange. You're doing the same kind of idea here, just with a higher focus on single targets and for more damage, ultimately. So, there is that. Now, I didn't really talk about Mirror of Arioctes, but this is a great skill to splash in. It is specifically doing Lightning Retaliation, and since the Druid tends to use lightning damage a lot, this is actually fantastic. So if you just want to splash this in, if you have like a spare couple of points lying around, this is actually really great and can really help you save your life in a lot of pinches. So that's really effective. I've already talked about Star Pact. I don't use Nullification often. It can be nice. I just don't find it that useful myself. Obviously, you don't want Fabric of Reality because you have no access to chaos damage naturally, so that doesn't matter. Conversion, I'll use this in hardcore solo, but that's about it. That's about as far as that goes. And again, I already discussed how I compared to Albrecht's Aether Ray, Devastation is more limited. This is always going to be better for a Druid because of the Disintegration lightning damage. You have a bit more diversity of what you can do with this and the amount of damage you can bust out here. And again, the Wendigo Totem isn't really enhanced by any of these. Now, I didn't talk about this even though it is a pet because it only lives for 20 seconds. Still not a great justification for Primal Bond. This was a bit more viable when it didn't die after 20 seconds. But yeah, I just ultimately really don't like that change. Yes, it's an incredibly powerful pet. Yay. It's got a 45-second recharge, and it dies in half that time. It requires some help. It requires some item help. And this also, by the way, extends to Devouring Swarm, which does Vitality and Bleeding Resistance down. And again, you're not really doing a whole lot of Vitality damage. So that's why I really didn't cover those specific skills. They just really, without specific pieces of equipment, they really don't operate that effectively. Now, again, actually, I really want to quickly have another conversation about Calidor's Tempest, because it does, again, incorporate lightning damage in Inferno. This is another really nice skill you can splash in there, especially if you're using ranged, because you can actually take Wrath of Agravix and blast melee range enemies aside, except for, of course, obviously bosses and large enemies, but it is very helpful for that specific reason, so I do like that. I don't often splash it in. Pardon me, that was just me punching my mic by accident. I don't often splash it in, but it is a really nice thing to have if you really want to go for that. But yeah, hands down, my favorite way of running this is two-handed weapon, preferably ranged. I do prefer ranged a little bit more. And that's how I usually run this. But that's an overview of all the skills, why I do and do not use specific skills for this class combination, at least when running improv. So, with that being said, thank you all very much for joining me. If you have any comments, questions, concerns, ideas, suggestions, or requests, please leave them down in the comment section below. And thank you all very much for joining me, and have a great 24 hours.